Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
On Christmas Eve, around 6 in the evening, while the neighborhood was glowing with the warm, artificial cheer of twinkling lights and inflatable Santas, and every house seemed filled with the illusion of peace and comfort, my parents sat me down at our dinner table, our ugly old maple thing they've had since I was in middle school, and told me, very matter-of-factly, that they wouldn't be renewing my room in the new year. That's the word they used. Renewing. Like my life was a lease agreement. No warning, no lead-up conversation, not even a hint of tension earlier in the day. One second, we were eating overcooked ham and laughing about some old memory of me and Kyle stealing eggnog as kids, and the next, they just dropped it like a casual footnote in a story that didn't belong to me anymore. I smiled. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even ask for clarification, though I probably should have, just to watch them twist themselves into knots trying to make it sound fair or loving or for my own good. But I didn't. Because in that exact moment, something inside me turned. Not like a snapping twig, but more like the slow creak of a heavy iron gate closing in the back of my head. Click. Locked. Done. Now, I'm sure if you asked them, they'd say it was all about tough love or boundaries or some other self-help phrase they half-absorbed from a YouTube video Kyle probably forwarded them. And maybe on the surface, I do look like the kind of grown woman who's overstayed her welcome. 38, divorced, no kids, working remote as a freelance project consultant after burning out of my last job. Moved back home after everything fell apart with Scott and promised, crossed my heart, I'd only stay a few months. That was 2 years ago. 2 birthdays, 2 Christmases, 1 broken wrist, and 3 depressive spirals ago. But here's the thing no one really gets about moving back home in your 30s. It swallows you. The minute you unpack that first box in your old room and hang up a single picture or restock the closet with anything more than a weekend bag, your autonomy just dissolves. Slowly. Silently. Until one day, you wake up and realize you're 40 minutes from any of your real friends, eating leftovers labeled with sticky notes by your mother, and flinching every time your father walks past your laptop like he might comment on how long you've been sitting. They made it sound like they were doing me a favor. You just need a little push, honey, my mom said, stirring her wine with a half-melted ice cube like it was the most normal thing to do while emotionally evicting your daughter. You've been coasting, she added, as if my quiet contribution to every bill, every chore, every doctor's appointment she didn't feel like going to, counted for nothing. It's time to be a grown-up, Dad chimed in, cutting into his dry meatloaf like a man delivering divine wisdom. And I watched the whole little scene play out with this weird calmness, like I was watching someone else's life unravel through a screen. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. Not really. Because anger's honest, and this thing that began blooming in my chest wasn't rage. It was cold. Methodical. It was the kind of realization you don't scream about. You build around it. You plan around it. And I had more than enough reason to start planning. Because for the past 5 years, the credit card my parents used for literally everything, groceries, prescriptions, takeout when Linda didn't feel like cooking, was in my name. My credit. My account. My auto payments. They never even bothered to ask why the card kept working when Dad's own visa got declined for the 3rd time in a row. And I didn't mind at first. Back when it felt like a shared system, a mutual support. But now? Now they were showing me exactly where I stood. So I smiled. I finished my plate. I even helped clear the dishes, humming along to some Sinatra Christmas cover my mom had been looping since Thanksgiving. And when I went upstairs to my room, the one they so generously renewed for the past 24 months, I didn't cry. I didn't text Kyle or anyone else. I opened my laptop, logged into the credit card account, and stared at the list of recent transactions. Target, Walmart, CVS, Amazon. Half the town's economy seemed to be running through this card. I let my finger hover over the freeze card button, but didn't press it. Not yet. I had something better in mind. See, the thing is, when someone shows you what they really think of you, when they strip you of the polite fictions and give you the truth raw and ugly, you don't get mad. You get precise. And while I sat there, scrolling through 6 months of grocery lists and gift purchases that never once had my name on them, I realized something. They weren't just cutting me off. They were erasing me. As if I'd only ever been a placeholder, a temporary burden. The girl who couldn't keep her marriage, couldn't keep her house, couldn't get her shit together without running home. They didn't see me as a person anymore. They saw me as a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. So fine. If they wanted me gone, I'd go. But I wouldn't go quietly. Not after everything I'd swallowed to keep this damn house running. And here's the part that people online never believe when I tell them. I didn't want revenge. Not really. What I wanted was acknowledgement. A simple, "Hey Cass, we know we leaned on you. Thanks." But that never came. Not from Rick, not from Linda, not from Golden Boy Kyle, who still lives 15 minutes away and shows up with a six-pack once a month like that counts as love. So yeah, I smiled. And the next morning, while they were still in bed, I packed my clothes, deleted every auto payment attached to that card, and called the credit company to issue a new one, with a brand new number. That night, I watched from the kitchen as my mom stood in front of the open fridge, blinking like it was a magic trick gone wrong. She tapped her phone twice, tried again, then turned to my father and said, "Rick, the grocery order didn't go through." He grunted. "Try again." She did. Another decline. And me? I just stood there, stirring my tea, eyes calm, voice steady as hell, and said, "Yeah, weird." Was it petty? Maybe. Was it necessary? Tell me, have you ever supported someone for years only to be thrown out like a guest at a motel? Would you let that go? Or would you make damn sure they remembered who kept the lights on? Let me tell you what happened next. Because that was just the beginning. The next morning didn't come with drama, at least not right away, and there was no cinematic soundtrack swelling behind me, no thunderstorm crashing outside the window as I zipped up my suitcase. Instead, it was quiet in that almost surreal way mornings after betrayal tend to be: sunlight slipping between half-open blinds, the kettle hissing low on the stove, the sound of my father clearing his throat from the living room, and the faint scent of stale tinsel and pine-scented air freshener still lingering from the night before, pretending everything was festive and warm and loving when, in reality, everything had already cracked in half. I had packed before they even opened their bedroom door, not because I was in a rush or running from some big dramatic scene, but because I wanted them to wake up and see the echo of me, the neatly made bed, the empty drawers, the folded blanket left with the faintest note of perfume I'd worn the day before, all subtle signals that said, "I heard you, I understood you, and I acted accordingly," which, honestly, was more courtesy than they'd shown me the night before. I had already made the calls by the time they stumbled into the kitchen, Mom still in her faded Christmas pajama pants with coffee stains from years past, and Dad wearing that same gray sweatshirt he always wore when he pretended he wasn't in a bad mood. The card company was surprisingly helpful, apparently, being the sole owner on an account that had quietly accumulated over 5 years of shared living gives you more leverage than people expect. I explained that I was relocating, that I wanted to issue a new card number for security purposes, that the old one had possibly been compromised, not a lie, exactly, depending on how you define compromised, and within 15 minutes. The freeze was active, the reissue was confirmed, and every linked auto payment, every online grocery order, every pharmacy subscription, and even that ridiculous QVC account my mother used when she thought no one was watching was suddenly and irrevocably cut off. I sat there, drinking my coffee slowly, waiting, not because I wanted to witness their confusion firsthand, but because some part of me needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, that I hadn't dreamed up years of quietly funding their household while they treated me like a piece of temporary furniture they could push into a corner and forget. And then it happened, just like I imagined it. My mother stood in front of the fridge, blinking at her phone, tapping the screen like it had betrayed her. She sighed loudly, that exaggerated exhale she always did when she was hoping someone would ask what was wrong, and then said, with a tone of mild irritation but zero suspicion, "Looks like the order didn't go through. Must be a glitch." She tried again. Another decline. She called my father over, who, of course, knew even less about how the card worked, and he stood behind her, muttering about Wi-Fi, about the app being buggy, about how nothing works right after holidays, and I just sipped my coffee and said, huh. Yeah. Weird. No one looked at me. Not yet. Not really. Because it hadn't fully registered that the gears had stopped turning and that I, the silent engine beneath their illusion of control, had stepped off the treadmill without warning. The real fallout came a few hours later, after I'd driven to my friend Lara's place, just a temporary stop, somewhere warm with a decent pull-out couch and someone who didn't look at me like I was a failure. I was halfway through folding laundry when my phone lit up with Mom's name, and for a second, I thought about ignoring it, letting her stew in the confusion a bit longer, but curiosity got the better of me, and I answered with the kind of bright, falsely cheerful tone you reserve for customer service calls. She didn't waste time. Cassie, she said, voice tight, controlled, like she was trying not to sound too accusatory too quickly. Do you know anything about the credit card? It's not working. I had to cancel the grocery order and... is something wrong with the account? I paused for just a moment, not long, but long enough for her to notice, and then said, oh yeah. I had the card shut off. Got a new one. Security stuff, you know how it is. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain further. I let the silence do its job. She hesitated. Okay, but when will we be able to place orders again? Your father needs his medication refill, and, well, you should have told us, sweetie. There it was. You should have told us. Not thank you for helping us, not we didn't realize we depended on you that much, not even we're sorry for how we dropped that news on you last night like you were an intern being let go from a seasonal gig. Just a quiet scold. A poke at the etiquette of revenge, not the ethics of what came before it. I smiled, even though she couldn't see me. I figured since I won't be living there anymore, I should probably stop paying for things. It's part of growing up, right? She didn't respond for a long beat. Just breathing. Then a small click as she hung up without another word. I stared at the phone for a while, and I won't lie, I did feel something then. Not triumph, not guilt, but this strange mix of emptiness and control, like I'd finally taken the wheel of a car that had been coasting toward a ditch for far too long, and even if I didn't know exactly where I was headed, at least I wasn't sitting in the passenger seat anymore. And before anyone judges me or asks why I didn't just talk to them like an adult, let me ask you this. How do you talk like an adult with people who still see you as a child? How do you explain that the money, the groceries, the endless invisible labor of being the helpful daughter had a cost, and it wasn't just financial, it was emotional, spiritual. The kind of cost that eats away at your self-worth until you're nothing but a polite placeholder in your own life. So no, I didn't tell them in advance. And no, I didn't feel the need to ease the transition. They taught me everything I needed to know about consequences. Now they could learn a few things too. It started small, like all unravelings do, almost imperceptibly at first, like a draft under a locked door or the quiet shift of a floorboard under too much weight, and for the first couple of days, my parents treated the shutdown of the credit card like it was some temporary hiccup, a momentary glitch in their otherwise uninterrupted access to everything they needed, everything they expected to function on autopilot, as if the universe itself was responsible for keeping their fridge full there. Amazon carts delivered, and their pharmacy orders shipped on time. But as the hours ticked by and their usual rituals began to break down, no Instacart drop-off, no standing Walgreens bag with Dad's blood pressure meds, no automatic subscription boxes filled with granola bars or whatever garbage Linda liked to pretend was clean eating, a new tension began to settle into the house, one that didn't scream or throw tantrums, but hovered in every interaction like the smell of burnt toast that won't leave even after you've aired the whole place out. They didn't call me again after that first conversation, or at least not directly, which surprised me less than it should have, and instead, they began resorting to the time-tested strategy of passive communication, which in our family was practically a second language, pointed remarks left on voicemails, dramatic sighs captured in the background of messages from Kyle, and cryptic posts on Facebook that, while pretending to be about the trials of aging, somehow mentioned phrases like, ungrateful children, or some people forget who fed them. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't engage. I knew better by then. But what they hadn't realized, what they still hadn't fully grasped, was that the pantry war had already been lost long before they even noticed it had started. Because it wasn't just about groceries, not really. It wasn't about milk or cereal or medicine or delivery apps. It was about the illusion of control, about the structure they thought they could rely on, and what happens when the scaffolding you thought was decorative turns out to be load-bearing. Every time Linda tried to log into her usual grocery app and got blocked by a payment error, or every time Rick stood in front of the pantry and muttered about how low everything was getting, they were feeling the absence of me. Not just my physical presence in the house, but the quiet, daily, unspoken labor I'd been doing to keep things moving. And now, in that silence, they were hearing it all too loud. I wasn't sitting idle, either. While they stumbled through their frozen routines, I was rebuilding. Laura, bless her, let me crash in her guest room without questions, without pity, and while I didn't tell her every detail, she knew enough from the look on my face and the bags under my eyes that something had snapped in me. Something that probably wasn't going to be undone by a long walk and a talk over wine. So, I worked hard. I updated my resume, reached out to old clients, restarted a freelance contract I'd previously walked away from out of sheer burnout, and bit by bit, I remembered who I was before I became someone's daughter-turned-lodger. Someone reduced to a permanent guest in her own family. And then came Kyle. I should have known he'd get involved eventually. The family golden boy, the one who only appeared at Thanksgiving with store-bought pie and a smug little smile, always ready with unsolicited advice he read on LinkedIn or heard from his chiropractor. He called me 3 days after the card shut down, voice sharp and performative like he'd practiced the speech in his car before dialing. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask where I was staying. He just jumped straight in with, "So you're really going to punish mom and dad like this? Is this your big grown-up move, Cassie? Cutting off their food?" I took a moment before answering because, if I hadn't, I might have said something I couldn't take back. Instead, I replied, slowly and clearly, I didn't cut off their food. I stopped paying for it. There's a difference. He scoffed, a sound so rehearsed it might as well have come with stage directions. "They're your parents. And I'm their daughter, not their retirement plan," I said, feeling the anger rise in my throat like warm acid, but refusing to let it spill. "You know they've been using that card for years, right? Groceries, pharmacy, household crap. You ever think to ask who's been footing that bill while you've been hosting wine tastings in your backyard?" He started to protest, but I cut him off. "You want to help them? Great. Step up. Take over the payments. Put your money where your mouth is." There was a long silence after that, long enough to confirm what I already knew. Kyle didn't want to help. He just wanted me to keep playing the role so he wouldn't have to feel guilty for staying out of it. Back at the house, I knew the situation was getting worse. Linda had started trying to create new accounts, new Instacart, new pharmacy logins, but what she forgot was that many of them were still tied to my email. She never asked me to change it. Never even thought it mattered. So every time she tried to place an order or reset a password, I got a ping. And I didn't delete them. I watched. I observed. It was like having a window into their slow unraveling, and I took no pleasure in it, but I also felt no obligation to intervene. And then came the call from Dad. I hadn't heard his voice directly since Christmas Eve, and when he finally called, it wasn't filled with rage or demand or even anger. It was worse. It was disappointment. That low, quiet tone fathers use when they want you to feel like you've failed some sacred moral contract. "I don't understand what's happening here, Cass," he said, sighing heavily into the phone like the weight of the world had landed on his shoulders alone. "You're being vindictive. It's not like you." And that was when I snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. "It's exactly like me, Dad. The me you raised. The me who watched how you taught people lessons by withholding affection, by using silence as punishment, by pretending everything was fine while quietly making people squirm. I learned from the best." He didn't say much after that. And I realized something then, something that changed the whole shape of the game. This wasn't just about a card or a pantry or even rent. This was about control. About ownership. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't theirs to control anymore. Checkmate. It was strange, really, how I didn't go looking for anything that afternoon. There was no master plan, no checklist of revenge strategies, no grand scheme unfolding like some cinematic drama, but rather, I went digging in the attic simply because I needed something mundane, a set of winter boots I had stashed during last February's thaw and never pulled back down again, and the irony of what I found in their place was so sharp, so biting, that it felt less like discovery and more like the attic itself had whispered, "Here, now you understand." The attic in my parents' house was the kind of cramped, dusty space that didn't welcome visitors but tolerated them, filled with sagging cardboard boxes and plastic tubs half-melted from years of July heat, with faded masking tape labels that hadn't meant anything since Bush was in office, and the same rusted pull-down ladder that had once terrified me as a child. I climbed up into that space with a flashlight clamped between my teeth and no particular intention beyond getting my boots and maybe a moment of peace, because Lara's apartment, bless her for offering, was starting to feel too tight, too full of someone else's rhythms, and I needed a place where the dust settled slow and the air wasn't trying to comfort me. I don't even remember what made me open the box labeled Christmas Stuff, 2002, except that it was slightly ajar, and I have always had the kind of curiosity that unravels me. The kind that doesn't respect boundaries or boxes or years gone by. Inside were the usual decorations, old tinsel, ornaments made from popsicle sticks and glitter glue, a couple strands of dead lights, but underneath, tucked between tissue paper and a long-forgotten wreath, were envelopes. Dozens of them. Bank envelopes. Statements. Tax records. Not mine. Theirs. I sat back on my heels, the flashlight now casting long shadows across the pink insulation like some kind of interrogation light, and I started to read. First out of curiosity. Then confusion. Then, slowly, with growing horror and something worse than anger recognition. Because as I flipped through those statements, what emerged wasn't a portrait of two struggling retirees dependent on their daughter to make ends meet, but rather a carefully hidden reality in which my parents, Rick and Linda, the same people who'd told me they could barely afford gas some months and who acted like every grocery run I covered was a life-saving gift, were not only solvent, but comfortably so. Multiple accounts. Savings that had never been mentioned. A mutual fund tucked away under Rick's name with a balance that made me want to laugh out loud in the attic's stale air. They weren't broke. They weren't scraping by. They had been lying. The realization didn't hit all at once like a car crash or a slap across the face. It bled into me slowly, each page of documentation dripping another ounce of betrayal into a wound I hadn't even realized was still open. This wasn't about survival or miscommunication or different definitions of financial stress. This was about narrative. About them carefully constructing a version of reality in which I was the burden, the overgrown daughter who wouldn't leave, the one they generously supported despite their own tight finances. But none of it was true. The truth was that I'd been holding up the structure of a house they never intended to share. And here's where things started twisting deeper, uglier. I remembered a conversation from years ago, long before my marriage had fallen apart, when Rick had pulled me aside during a barbecue and said, with that familiar smirk that always walked the line between fatherly advice and condescension, "You've got to learn how to keep your money close, Cass. Don't let people take advantage of you, even if they're family." At the time, I thought he was talking about Scott. I see now he was rehearsing his own script. I carried those envelopes downstairs like evidence, not entirely sure what I was going to do with them, just knowing that I couldn't unsee them. I sat on the edge of what used to be my bed, now stripped and bare, my suitcase still half-zipped from days ago, and I laid out the papers one by one until the room looked like a crime scene. And in a way, it was. It wasn't just about the money. That's too easy a conclusion. It was about trust, about how far someone is willing to go to preserve their comfort at the expense of your stability. I remembered every conversation where Linda had fretted about the rising cost of milk, every time Rick said something like, "We're just trying to keep the lights on," while I quietly updated the shared Amazon list with the essentials they'd stopped buying themselves. I thought I was being helpful. I thought I was giving back. But I was being used. And not just out of desperation, out of convenience. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I scanned every document, created a backup folder, and sent it to an encrypted drive just in case I ever needed to prove that I wasn't crazy, that the support I'd offered hadn't been charity, it had been necessity. Theirs. Not mine. And the next morning, while they sat at home no doubt puzzling over how to restock the pantry without assistance, I scheduled a consultation with a consumer attorney I found online. I didn't need legal revenge. I needed clarity. I needed to know how much debt was technically mine, what charges had been placed in my name, and whether there was a path to offloading any portion of it. Because the part one hadn't told anyone, not even Laura, was that over the last 2 years, their spending on that card, my card, had ballooned, subtle at first, then excessive. I'd told myself they deserved it, that it was part of the trade-off for living in their home. But now I saw it for what it was, a quiet theft justified by guilt and sealed by silence. I thought about confronting them right away, walking back into that house with the stack of papers and forcing them to look me in the eye while I read off balances and dates. But something held me back. Something colder, more calculated. I didn't want an apology. I wanted impact. I wanted them to feel the shift the same way I had, slow, steady, inescapable. So I waited. And while I waited, I smiled. Because now I knew the truth. And the truth, even when it shatters everything you thought you knew, has a strange way of setting the bones right. They wanted me out of their house. But they were about to find out what it really means to lose access. Not just to a room. Not just to a card. But to me. It was a cold, slow Sunday when I decided the moment had finally come, not out of spite, and not even for the sake of theatrical satisfaction. Though I'd be lying if I said the thought of watching their expressions as the truth unfolded didn't carry a certain thrill, but because some decisions don't need to simmer forever, and there comes a point where silence stops being power and becomes cowardice, where withholding becomes avoidance, and I was done avoiding everything that had already poisoned the air in that house like invisible gas no one wanted to name. So I called them, calmly, clearly, and said I was coming by for dinner, that I wanted to have one final proper meal together before moving forward, a phrase I knew was vague enough to keep them guessing, to lure them into believing I might be ready to forgive or reintegrate myself into the family dynamic they were desperate to keep curated and clean. Linda was the first to take the bait, her voice warming immediately, rising to that eager register she always used when she thought the balance of power was about to swing back in her favor. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, like we'd simply had a misunderstanding about a misplaced casserole dish, like the past 2 weeks hadn't been a slow, deliberate exposure of everything they'd tried to conceal under years of curated disappointment and subtle manipulation. Rick didn't speak to me directly until I arrived, but I could feel his hand in the arrangement. The grill would be lit, the table set with real plates instead of paper ones, and my chair would be back at its usual place, not the end, not the periphery, but the seat I always took before everything cracked. They were setting the stage for reconciliation, for performance, but they didn't know they were hosting their own funeral, at least the death of the power they once had over me. I arrived just after 4, not too early to seem eager, not too late to seem dismissive, dressed in dark jeans and a simple blouse, nothing flashy, no war paint, no armor, just myself, steady, composed, a version of me they hadn't met yet. The dining room smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary, that unmistakable holiday blend that was supposed to remind you of warmth, tradition, roots, but for me, it only reminded me of how many meals I'd eaten while biting my tongue. How many Thanksgivings I'd spent pretending that every comment about my career or my relationship status or my weight was just concern dressed up as love. But I didn't sit down right away. I took my time, made polite small talk, complimented the table settings, asked about the neighbor's new dog, and smiled just enough to keep the atmosphere falsely relaxed, just long enough for them to think they'd won. Then I pulled out the folder. It was just a plain, cream-colored file, the kind you'd see in a banker's office or a middle school teacher's drawer. Nothing ominous or heavy-looking, but the moment I placed it on the table between us, their postures changed. Rick leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, while Linda's hand paused mid-reach toward the serving spoon like her brain was trying to decide whether to ignore it or interrogate it. I didn't rush. I didn't explain. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and began laying the documents out like cards in a game neither of them realized they'd already lost: bank statements, transaction logs, screenshots of auto payments, scanned copies of the hidden savings account, the mutual fund, the entire financial theater they'd built around the myth of scarcity. Linda's face went first, her lips tightening, the color draining slightly from her cheeks as she recognized her own handwriting on deposit slips she'd sworn never existed, and then Rick, whose expression didn't twist in shame or remorse, but in something colder, like he was recalculating a route he thought was already secure. Kyle, who had decided to show up after all, sat between them looking like someone who had just walked into the wrong funeral and couldn't figure out if he was supposed to offer condolences or flee the scene. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask questions. I just looked at them, calmly, and said, "This isn't about groceries anymore. You know that, right?" Rick cleared his throat, but said nothing. Linda tried for her usual defensive confusion. "Cassie, what is this? Why would you bring this?" "We're trying to have a nice dinner," but I held up a hand, cutting her off as gently as I could without losing the edge. "You told me it was time to grow up. That I'd overstayed. That I needed to learn how to stand on my own. So I did. But what I've learned over the past few weeks is that I wasn't the one dependent." I paused just long enough to let it land. "You were." The silence that followed wasn't the shocked kind or the angry kind. It was the kind that vibrates with the realization that nothing will ever be the same again, that something has shifted so permanently that even pretending to go back is no longer an option. Cole tried to speak, but I turned to him with a look that shut it down before it started. "You don't get to referee this," I said quietly. "Not when you've spent the last decade showing up just enough to keep your hands clean." And with that, I stood up, pushed in my chair, and slid one last document across the table, an affidavit from the credit card company confirming the transfer of full financial responsibility for the previous account, retroactively approved due to fraud and unauthorized use. I didn't say anything further, didn't wait for protest or pleas, because there was nothing left to say. I'd paid enough. My key, the one they'd insisted I keep just in case, landed with a small, final clink on the tablecloth beside Rick's untouched water glass, and I turned toward the door with a steadiness I hadn't known I was capable of carrying until that exact moment. As I reached the hallway, Linda finally spoke, voice cracking, small, pathetic in the way only those who've been caught without an escape plan can sound. "You don't have to do this." I turned, only slightly, and said, "No. I get to." Outside, the air was sharp and clean, the sky bruised with the soft purples and grays of an early winter dusk, and I took a long breath as I walked down the driveway, passing Kyle's car, the same one he used to pick up his kids from soccer. The same one that had never once pulled up when I'd needed help moving or navigating the aftermath of my divorce. I didn't hate them, not even close, but I no longer owed them anything, and there is a freedom in that so large it doesn't fit into words. I didn't look back. Because they told me to grow up. And I finally did. But here's the part they'll never admit, the part that will haunt them every time they sit at that table and see the empty chair across from them. It turns out grown-ups don't let people use them, not even the people who raised them. Not anymore.